In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, over 2,000 miles away from continental landmass, lie the Sandwich Islands, otherwise known as Hawaii. The most recent island, the Big Island, or as most people call the entire group of islands, Hawaii, was formed less than 1 million years ago, the same way every other Hawaiian island was created. An oceanic hotspot was fixed in the middle of the constantly moving Pacific Plate. This means the volcanoes underneath pierced through the plate and created islands after volcanic eruption and plate movement. A new island is being formed as you watch this video. Loihi. It is still thousands of years away from forming and will be south of the Puna and Kau regions of the Big Island. Plant and animal life came in three forms: waves from the ocean, seed-carrying birds, and spore and cell-carrying winds. One of these methods, particularly the ocean, is how the first human life arrived on Hawaii. There are three questions to be asked before we can talk about the arrival of humans to Hawaii. Who were those that sailed there? Why did they sail? And how? The first people who sailed to Hawaii were Polynesians who originated in Southeast Asia. The very first of them were most likely from the Marquesas Islands in what is nowadays part of modern-day French Polynesia. They sailed to Hawaii for multiple reasons. One of them was to avoid overpopulation, which was the result of surplus. This would inevitably grow along with the population to an extent that would be unsustainable to maintain. However, the individuals who decided to find new land did not go unprepared. They were immensely organized so that when they found the new land, they had everything they needed to construct a new society. They brought animals such as pigs, dogs, and chickens. They also brought many forms of plants such as bananas, taro, coconuts, sweet potatoes, gourds, and more. They brought large amounts of food and water for themselves and their animals. They brought tools for building structures, chopping trees, and building the canoes that they would take. Groups usually had 3 to 4 canoes, with 20 to 40 people on each, which had to be a mix of females and males from a large number of families to avoid inbreeding. A few people also had to possess the knowledge to sail and the knowledge to start a new community. However, even with all this, some did still not make it. They navigated the Pacific through the stars, clouds, floating objects, birds, fish, and the currents. The canoes were large, with hollowed-out areas to store supplies. These would either be connected to form a catamaran or would have outriggers attached. For catamarans, a floor was attached in between the canoes as a living area with a hut in the middle for protection during bad weather. The canoes were sail ships with paddles for steering. The first voyages arrived on the southern coast on the Big Island. There are many debates on when the first Polynesians arrived. The first wave, which was comprised of people from the Marquesas Islands, was most likely between 100 and 600. The second wave, which was comprised of Tahitians, arrived between 900 and 1,200. When the first wave did arrive, they most likely started with setting up agriculture and scouting their surroundings on the island. They would take in differences from their previous islands they lived on and would make changes to their lifestyles to better suit any environmental changes. This first wave was left to themselves for a couple hundred years, in which they occupied all major islands. However, the second wave that came would change Hawaiian social structure until the arrival of Europeans. These newcomers were from Tahiti and were bigger than the original settlers. This meant they swiftly established dominance over the islanders and formed a social structure where they were at the top, with the previous inhabitants reduced to hoi polloi. After these waves of migrations, Hawaii would be secluded until the arrival of Europeans. The ruling Tahitians formed a hereditary ruling class called the Ali'i. This consisted of weaker and stronger chiefs all vying for control over their island and the entirety of Hawaii. War was constant, with the Ali'i themselves leading their troops to battle. Being a strong warrior was a trait one must have if they were to become an Ali'i, especially if one knew how to catch a spear midair. However, these strong men who constantly waged war didn't reduce the overall population to any significant degree. Battles could be fought for days on end without many casualties between warrior to warrior. Along with a strong memory and good marital status, you could find yourself being a high-up Ali'i. The Ali'i themselves were easy to spot with their red and yellow capes and helmets made from bird feathers, and the higher ones had royal staff that would warn the average citizens of the incoming nobility who were either forced to leave the area or to go prone. The Ali'i ruled the Mokupuni, which was divided into Moku, which was divided into sections of territory known as Uhuapua'a. It was a piece of land that started at the ocean and stretched into the highlands, and the borders would be based on physical geography such as rivers. Each would be accompanied by a minor Ali'i chief and Konohiki. These Ahuapua'a had almost every resource they needed and were almost completely self-sufficient, however they still traded from time to time. The ocean would supply fish, salt, seaweed, and other goods. The middlands were used for farming crops, and the highlands provided trees for wood. These Ahuapua'a were not owned by the lesser Ali'i, but permitted by the higher Ali'i in exchange for their obedience. The commoners had free will to move and would occupy land for generations. During the occupation, the occupants paid by giving the Ali'i a chunk of the crop, and the commoners would also help with construction projects and other communal work. The Ali'i had absolute power. However, if you were cruel and unjust, the commoners could go to choose an Ali'i to follow in a weird, almost democratic system where you could pick which absolute ruler to follow. This made sure no Ali'i was too tyrannical, because if you were too repressive, you wouldn't gain the support you needed to rule. And everyone also followed the kapu system, a sort of draconian rule set for things you couldn't do, such as men and women eating together and women eating pork and bananas. And sometimes kapu would be placed on animals such as fish to let them repopulate it, and breaking kapu usually meant death. Another important part of Hawaiian social life was religion, and many Hawaiians believed in gods both major and minor, and each represented something different, and some people still make offerings to the gods this very day. However, one thing that was essential was the family structure, the ohana. Mentioned before, the ohana occupied small plots of land and had houses at every elevation with specific family members doing specific tasks and at specific elevations. Any surplus would be given to other members, and they mostly spent their time at the coast and thus had the largest house there. Anybody, including guests, could sleep in it, and one half of it was a sleeping platform which was covered in thick mats for comfort, and the ohana had a wide variety of structures, from canoe building shacks and mat-making buildings for women. Cooking was mostly done outdoors, and staple foods were taro, poi, banana, sweet potatoes, seaweeds, fish, dog, and pork and chicken. Large batches of food would be cooked in an imu. Whole hogs were cooked in ways that you may have seen if you've ever been to a commercial luau, and there would be a hut for cooking if it was raining. However, marriage was very different from the modern social standards that we have today. Most of the time it was just between a man and a woman, but men could sometimes have multiple wives and vice versa, although this was mainly done by the high Ali'i. During the fall harvest, there would be a cessation of all warfare to do a sporting event, the makahiki, and it was during one of these events that the first Europeans arrived in Hawaii. James Cook landed in 1778 in the Kealalekua Bay. He was perceived to be the Hawaiian god Lono, so he got all his supplies for free. However, he outstayed his visit and had drained the resources of the area, and sealing became a problem. He tried to sail back to Maui, but got shipwrecked and had to go back to the bay. Here he made a big mistake. The Hawaiians were angry, and he fired his cannons, and during the night some natives stole a skiff, so along with a shore party he went to kidnap the ruling Ali'i. It went well at first. However, his wife saw what was happening and started screaming and begging him not to go. And when he did find out what was happening, he refused to go, and the British were forced to back down to the shore. And there it was a marine who shot at a native with armor on. However, the musket ball misfired and simply bounced off the armor, and then they countered attack and killed Cook. The remaining sailors returned to England. However, the Hawaiians still respected the British, and Hawaii became a major resupply port for merchants and whalers in the Pacific. And on the Big Island, the ruling Ali'i died in 1782 and chose his son to be next in line. But it was his nephew, a man named Kamehameha, was to be in charge of war, and it was him who united the islands. The son attacked, and in battle he was killed, and not long after, Kamehameha captured two men, Isaac Davis and John Young, and rather than having them executed, he made them teach him to effectively use modern cannons and guns. John Young ended up becoming a trusted advisor. Another haole who befriended Kamehameha was John Parker. When Captain George Vancouver introduced cows to the Hawaiians, Kamehameha placed a kapu on them to let them remultiply. However, their numbers became too large and began terrorizing the villages and their crops. Parker was hired to bring them under control, and he managed to domesticate them, and some were butchered, which introduced beef to the Hawaiians. He ended up being rewarded with a few acres of land and married one of Kamehameha's granddaughters. He brought over Mexican cowboys to teach them cattle herding skills, and while he was expanding his ranch, Kamehameha was focused on conquering. Kamehameha looked to Maui, which was, along with Oahu, ruled by the Ali'i Kahekili. Kahekili at the time was on Oahu, and Kamehameha invaded. However, they both signed a temporary truce. and Kamehameha turned back to the Big Island to face his rival. However, he was attacked shortly after returning. However, Kamehameha won, and when his rival was going home, volcanic eruption killed many of his troops. Many saw this as the goddess of volcanoes, voicing her displeasure. Kamehameha built a heiau, which required a human sacrifice. His rival became this sacrifice. From here, Kamehameha had a staging ground for which he could unify Hawaii. The previous truce with Kahekili was broken, and when Kahekili attacked, this time it was the first modern battle in Hawaiian history, where both leaders possessed cannons and modern weapons. They fought in European style, and it ended in a stalemate. However, Kahekili died in 1794, and his son squabbled over his territory, which Kamehameha took advantage of. Every island east of Kauai was now under Kamehameha's control. When he did try to take Kauai, he lost a bunch of ships and a large storm that forced him back to Oahu. He failed once more, and then made an agreement with the ruler of that time. He would be the governor of the Kauai and would pay annual tribute. Kamehameha now united the Hawaiian Islands under his control. In the following years, the monarchy was strengthened and the elite remained unified. Kamehameha, in a smart move, made the elite governors of each of the islands. He increased diplomacy with Europeans and Americans, and he died in 1819. Just before the arrival of Christianity, the explosion of trade, and corporate oligarchy. In 1820, missionaries landed that would change Hawaiian history. Kamehameha II had abolished the kapu system when he ate with some women. When he was not punished by the gods, Hawaiians quickly abandoned the system. The missionaries arrived from New England and set up on Maui, Oahu, and the Big Island, and were horrified by the sexual customs and little clothing worn by women, and called the Hawaiian savages, who were being saved from hell. This, along with what they wanted to enforce, alienated them from the casual, laid-back Hawaiians. However, many elite and regular citizens took a keen interest in reading and writing, which would give them advantages in deals with the Americans and British. The missionaries taught the elite basic English with Christianity mixed in. Traditional Hawaiian religious beliefs and ideas were declining and were filled up with Western-style Christian beliefs. Converts had to take exams for knowledge of English and Christianity, and by 1830, 30% were training to pass these exams. This was not only because of the previously mentioned decline in traditional beliefs, but also the elite who passed, who encouraged everyone to join the church. The missionaries were happy for the elite's loyalty, but they also questioned the monarchy, who came from America, so they also thought that they needed to spread democracy. They couldn't directly change the government, however, they had to opt for sewing the fabric that would change the government into the sweater of a democratic society. More and more missionaries came, and by 1838 there were 90 of them. They established a college prep school in Punahou, and by 1827 Catholic missionaries arrived from France. However, they were locked up under being claims of French spies there to weaken British influence, and they were not let go until a frigate fired a few rounds into the Honolulu harbor. The missionaries also tried to close down the alcohol and women industries, but were unsuccessful with the alcohol industry. But they managed to plead the elite to stop women from swimming out to ships. These women were young and would swim out to sailors to exchange favors in exchange for money, clothes, or other goods. However, they would still meet with sailors in bars and then go back to the ships. When the elite banned sailors from going into towns at night and women banned from swimming with the ships, the sailors got angry and protested. When they were unsuccessful with their protest, one man named John Percival landed with some sailors to burn down the church. However, the natives stopped them, and since the natives were physically larger, they easily won. The conflict between the sailors and the missionaries would continue on for years. Another thing that happened during this time was the boom in trade in Hawaii. Hawaii became a major resupply port in the middle of the Pacific, and British merchants saw an opportunity and sold the elite European manufactured goods, clothes, and furniture. The elite afforded all of this due to the massive, highly valuable sandalwood, which would break in massive profits for British and American merchants selling in China. They were very slow to grow, and the workers had to walk up and down the mountains to collect the trees and then to bring them up and down. It was so unbearable that many of them pulled up the seeds and roots of the plant in the hopes that it would go extinct. The chiefs were always in debt as they kept on buying European goods. It would not last, and the trees almost went extinct. However, the whaling industry also contributed significant growth to the economy, and by 1824 there were 100 whaling ships that would use the port to dump their spoils to continue rather than having to return to New England. This helped the economy, but creative destruction helped bring the downfall of the whaling industry. The trading companies, who expanded into different sectors, survived and formed the backbone of the Hawaiian economy. They they became a corporate oligarchy by selling a product that would carry the Hawaiian economy for the next century: sugar. The first commercial plantation opened up in 1835, and the industry changed in the 1850s due to the California gold rush, as it was cheaper to ship agriculture from Hawaii to the west coast rather than it was to the east. The first problems the industry faced were lack of land, disinterested rulers, and the monarchy. Almost all of the land was owned by the elite, and almost no one wanted to become a large-scale export farmer. The monarchy held all the land and did not lease it or sell it until the 1848 Mahili, which split the land into one-third monarchy, one-third elite, and one-third everyone else. Everyone could buy and sell the land, and the elite sometimes sold their land to get rid of their debts. Some Westerners used legal loopholes to cheat out Hawaiians, and the natives had to fill out forms and pay a tax for a 3-acre plot. However, with long growing seasons and stellar soil, it was enough to feed a family. The monarchy hoped to make Hawaii a place with an economy dependent on small farmers, but many didn't even register the land, and many couldn't afford it. In 1850, foreigners could buy land, and by 1880, 80% of private land was owned by foreigners. A sizable number of the descendants of missionaries went into supplying the supplies and machinery to the sugar plantations after the fall of the whaling industry. This led them to expand into the shipping industry, which is extremely important for any island nation. This also led them to expand into banking, to tie up loose ends, and to have the capital to run an efficient supply chain. Plantations that failed were bought up by these firms. Some would even bankrupt by plantations by high interest loans and shipping rates. These corporations would always make a profit even when the sugar market fell. The biggest were called the Big Five, who consisted of Amtrak, Alexander and Baldwin, Castle and Cook, C. Brewer, and Theo and Davies and Co. They all had a board of directors to ensure a complete monopoly over their sectors, and were allied with the monarchy and relied on them for relations with outside interests. The monarchy was pressured by outsiders to form a democracy, and a two-chamber legislature was created with influence from the U.S. Congress and British Parliament, as these were the two most influential countries in Hawaii. However, the influence of the missionaries, who were American, played a role in deciding the country who would get Hawaii into their sphere of influence. And meanwhile, almost no natives wanted to take jobs in the sugar industry that was low-skill, labor-intensive, and in a humid climate. The plantations resorted to importing Chinese labor, which the laborers themselves didn't enjoy, as they lived in quarters with clothing and food rations and would be jailed if they didn't work. Some returned home with what they had earned, which was a good amount in China, and others moved into Hawaiian cities to form businesses. A Chinatown formed, and 60% of business licenses went to people who were Chinese, and in 1886, 1/4 of the population of Honolulu was Chinese, and by the late 1800s, it was around the same time of annexation, the population of Han Chinese in Hawaii had reached over 45,000. The Japanese arrived in 1868, but it took off in 1886 when Japan encouraged the lower classes to emigrate to Hawaii. Many wanted to save up money and then return home. 180,000 Japanese came for contract labor, and the plantation owners considered them valuable because they were seen as hard workers, obedient, and didn't cause them any issues. Some workers saw the potential in staying in Hawaii and set up small farms for produce or set up businesses. Japanese culture and ethnicity mixed with native Hawaiian ethnicity and culture to form a Hawaiian-Japanese culture mix that we still live with today. European workers wanted better wages and better working conditions, which the plantation owners responded by not hiring them, except the Portuguese, who worked for lower wages because of the economic turmoil in the country. However, the plantation owners still paid the Portuguese higher wages than Asians because they were considered ethnically closer to the owners than the Asians, and in the 1880s, the Big Five and the monarchy tried to bring in more natives into the sugar industry, a task that it failed at. The final mass import of laborers were Filipinos, and by 1832, there were over 100,000 working in the sugar fields of Hawaii. All of these different ethnic groups sometimes clashed with each other, which was encouraged by the plantation owners, who wanted them disunified, which would keep them from gaining power. Power itself in Hawaii would soon change hands. Monarchy went through many kings in a short period of time, and I will briefly go over what they did before moving to the Hawaiian Revolution. Kamehameha II took a trip to England for a meeting with the king, caught measles, and then died. Kamehameha III became the third king, tried to join the church, got 6 months probation before being allowed to join, lifted the penalties for adultery and had sex with his sister, forced some Christians to drink alcohol, and supported traditional Hawaiian cultural arts, such as the hula, which the missionaries saw as satanic, and the missionaries forced him to renounce everything. He then stopped caring about what happened to the country, let the missionaries substantially increase their power in the country. He issued the previously mentioned mahili, which allowed foreign powers to take control of almost all private land, and died in 1854 after a decline in sovereignty and control over the country. Kamehameha IV loved the British and named his son after Queen Victoria's son, Albert Edward, and he ended up dying at 4. He, along with his wife Queen Emma, helped establish the Episcopal Church, the Queen's Hospital, and the Iolani School, and the St. Andrew's Priory School, and then he died in 1863. He was succeeded by the last Kamehameha, Kamehameha V, who wanted to clamp down on foreign influence. He first replaced the 1852 Constitution with a new one that would slow down Western influence. At the time, the legislature was a mess. Non-natives didn't want to speak Hawaiian, and natives didn't want to speak English. He fixed this by just removing all the power from the legislature and gave them to himself. It was under his rule that the plantations brought in Asian contract workers, and profits went through the roof. There was also an equal trade balance in Hawaii for the first time, and he managed to successfully please Western and interests and native ones, and he died in 1872 on his birthday. Lunalilo was the last ruler of Hawaii under the House of Kamehameha. He was elected by the legislature and was very popular, although he didn't do much and died within a year of being the new king. The legislature elected a new king, which brought in a new house, the House of Kalakua. David Kalakua lost the previous election to Lunalilo, but this time he won against the previously mentioned wife of Kamehameha IV, Queen Emma. He clamped down on the sugar plantations who were trying to gain ever more power in the government. He promoted traditional Hawaiian culture, and he was called the Merry Monarch for his love of gambling, drinking, and the hula. He even has a festival named after him, the Merry Monarch Festival, and he had the Iolani Palace constructed, and it's right next to the state capitol. However, he was forced to sign the 1887 Bayonet Constitution, which was extremely unpopular with common Hawaiians. He died in 1891 in San Francisco. The final monarch of the Kalakua dynasty and of the Hawaiian kingdom was Queen Liliuokalani. She repealed the 1887 Constitution and tried to bring more power to the monarchy. However, she was overthrown in the Hawaiian Revolution. The Hawaiian Revolution started when a group of Americans under the leadership of Lord Thurston created the Committee of Safety. Thurston had a secret meeting with the president to be reassured that he would agree with the annexation. Meanwhile, the legislature was in total shambles. The Queen's supporters wanted to restore power to the monarchy, while Thurston's men wanted a constitution that would lead to annexation. Liliuokalani tried to pass bills that would provide revenue for the country. However, the annexation supporters opposed them in the hopes that bankruptcy would speed up annexation. Liliuokalani then wanted a new constitution that would remove property requirements for voters and that only Hawaiian subjects were allowed to vote. She didn't announce it immediately, but it got leaked, and Thurston and his allies began writing up documents for a new provisional government. When the Queen tried to go to the ambassador, John L. Stevens, she was not reassured for his support as he had secret meetings with the Committee of Safety. Stephen ordered troops to be sent to Honolulu, which arrived the next Monday. The Committee of Safety then seized administrative and government buildings and set up the provisional government. The Queen surrendered, and Thurston asked the government for annexation and territorial status. However, the president sent a delegate by the name of John Blount, who was not swayed by when the Big Five tried to convince him. He returned to Grover Cleveland, the new president at the time, who spoke to Congress on December 18, 1893, and declined annexation. The annexationists then set up the Republic of Hawaii to wait until a sympathetic president went into office, which came with the election of William McKinley. There was an attempted counter-revolution, but didn't do anything and failed after a confrontation with the police, and ended in the house arrest of the former queen, who ended up being released after a little over 8 months. Early July of 1898 saw Congress pass a resolution for annexation, which was signed by McKinley on July 7, 1898. Hawaii officially became a territory and would remain such throughout 2 world wars. Hawaii's government structure changed with annexation. There was no longer a monarchy, but multiple sources of power. A governor that was appointed for a 4-year term by the president with lots of power such as complete control over all appointments to administrative positions and vetoes. He could not be impeached and could enforce martial law at his will. The Big Five, who still had some control over politics through the economic dependency and would always have to be pleased. A delegate to the U.S. Congress was elected by the people and could not cast a vote, but would answer questions and interpretations about how bills and legislation could affect Hawaii, and also have meetings to inform citizens about what happened in the rest of the country, and would also bring back the demands of Hawaiians to Congress. However, if you wanted to be elected to Congress, you had to please the interests of the Big Five, and voters were required to speak fluent English, and another source of power came from the territorial legislature, which was elected by the people, but again required the representation of the Big Five and the sugar industry. Labor unions went on strike throughout the years in 1909, and the Japanese workers again in 1920, and the Filipino Federation of Labor went on strike in 1920 and again in 1924. All of these strikes failed, with the one in 1924 escalated to 20 people dying. However, the National Labor Relations, signed by FDR in 1935, led to the workers' first victory in 1937 by Filipinos. They got a 15% increase in wages, and it ended up being widespread because 2/3 of the sugar workers at the time were Filipino. The International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union formed in 1938 and went on strike against the Matson shipping line, which was particularly owned by Alexander and Baldwin. However, it failed, and there would be no strikes until after World War II. The USA had a bit of luck after Pearl Harbor. Despite the many casualties, planes, and ships that were destroyed, damaged, or sunk, all of the carriers at the time were at sea, and these carriers helped dominate and cripple the Japanese Navy at Midway. Martial law was immediately declared and would remain such throughout the rest of the war. A military governor was put in place, and the civilian government lost all power. Wages froze, press was censored, blackouts and curfews were common, set work hours and rent, and many more. If you criticized these measures, you were seen as unpatriotic. The Big Five took action and made sure they would keep their influence during the war. The biggest problem facing the military government were the over 160,000 Japanese people living on the islands, and they couldn't deport them or place them in concentration camps, and the labor they provided was essential to the Hawaiian economy. However, many of the Japanese American citizens were patriotic, and many tried and failed to sign up for the war effort. However, in 1943, they were finally allowed to enlist, and by the end of the month, over 9,000 enlisted in the newly created 442nd Infantry Battalion, and they were sent to North Africa to help invade Italy and capture Rome, along with the 100th Infantry, which was a battalion comprised of Japanese Americans who were part of the National Guard. They suffered 3 times the normal casualty rate in the 442nd, and ended up becoming the most decorated military unit in history. And after the war, a major economic and political shift came in Hawaii that would change Hawaii to this very day. The veterans of Hawaii returned from World War II and molded a new political structure and economic system that Hawaii still relies on today. One of these veterans, named Daniel Inouye, took advantage of veteran benefits, studied law at George Washington University where he got his degree, returned to Hawaii, and was elected to the Territorial House of Representatives, and after statehood, a senator, and to this day is still the second longest serving U.S. senator, serving almost 50 years. This was during a time when the Democratic Party flooded Hawaii and became, and still is, the main political party. During the flood, there were 2 men vying for control of the Democratic Party, John A. Burns and Jack Hall. Burns ended up winning, and the Democrats won 2/3 majority in the House of Territorial Legislature and was elected governor in 1948. The Democrats focused on getting statehood, but struggled as Congress was majority controlled by Southern Democrats and Republicans. But on August 21st, 1959, Hawaii officially became the 50th state, raising the same American-British mixed flags that has been raised since the days of Kamehameha. First thing that happened was the election of a governor and a seat to the House of Representatives. Along with this came the shattering of the Big Five, the political power that they wielded for so long that led to people like Jonah Kuhio to rule for 20 years. The economic dependency that Hawaii relied on and was broken, and so was the political leverage. You no longer had to please the big sugar business to get elected. You could campaign on helping the community or to serve other interests. The people could also now finally pick who they wanted to serve them, and could finally support people based on their rule, like the commoners under the elite centuries before. The decline in the sugar and pineapple industries brought forth a new economic dependency, replacing one with another: tourism. Tourism increasingly made more and more revenue as the revenue of the sugar industry died down, and by 1970, the revenue topped over $1 billion. Before COVID-19, Hawaii made around $20 billion from tourism in 2019 from visitor spending and state revenue. However, this doesn't even include the jobs and other economic sectors created by the tourism industry, although this does come at some costs, such as high property prices, which makes buying a new home difficult and mostly reserved for upper middle and upper income classes. However, while this might sound great, it would be unwise to think of this as some new glorified economic and political revolution. The foreign land sugar plantations were replaced by foreign companies who built hotels and resorts, Hawaii still had and still has an economy dependent on foreign markets. The political spectrum changed, but it's still very similar. If you want to run for office, it's best to run for the Democratic Party, as it is the party that holds most power in Hawaii. The old system of political and economic dominance is still there, just with different names and slightly different means of holding power. In the end, the old economic and political structures that were shattered were rebuilt, just with different materials. Hawaii in the 21st century is a whole different beast that is unlike any other state. Many thought that the election of a Republican governor was the end of single-party domination, but that turned out to be an exception. It's a place that has had over 1,000 years of history consisting of disunification, unification, outside influence, annexation, and so much more. It still has a large sovereignty movement who wish to break free from the U.S. It has had multiple incidents in 2018, and its economy, along with every other in the world, was shot and crippled by COVID-19. It has slowly opened up and has also started to diversify its economy as the tourists flood in from the airports to seek a break from the restrictions at home. It maintains a flora protection so that foreign plants won't hurt domestic flora within the state. It has produced celebrities and a president. It has and is still trying to diversify its energy dependency, looking into biofuels and alternative forms of energy. Hawaii's impact on the world has been big, and so it continues on as usual, with similar state and economic structures it has held for centuries.